Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all our distinguished guests, colleagues, and members of the academic and policy community. It is an honor to welcome you all to the State Bank of Pakistan's flagship 25th Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture, an event that continues our tradition of intellectual excellence, reflection, and policy dialogue. To formally begin today's proceedings, we will begin with a recitation from the Holy Quran, followed by a brief video to commemorate the legacy of State Bank's first governor, Zahid Husain.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
The central bank plays a vital role in the financial system of any country, and Pakistan is no exception. Today, the State Bank of Pakistan performs a number of important functions, from currency issuance, monetary policy formulation and implementation, to banking regulation, supervision, and research. It is banker and advisor to the government and the custodian of foreign exchange reserves. Yet, at the time of Pakistan's independence, the country had no central bank. Instead, the Reserve Bank of India managed currency issuance and the business of banking.
Ford Foundation had said that Pakistan would not be able to set up a bank for at least 3-4 years. And then Quaid-e-Azam contacted my father and he said, this is the problem. He said, give me some time and I'll see what I can do. And after 3 months he said, all right, 1st of July, we will have the opening.
At a time when Pakistan was vulnerable, within a year of its formation, he set up the State Bank in spite of the advice to the contrary by our British advisors at the time, who were running the Reserve Bank of India, which was actually the central bank for Pakistan till the State Bank was set up, which is about almost a year after partition.
Being a visionary leader, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah understood well the importance of a central bank in ensuring the financial independence of the newly formed state. He handpicked a man who had already proven his mettle, first as a distinguished member of the civil service, and then as a member of the committee tasked with the division of assets between India and Pakistan. That man was Zahid Husain.
So, Mr. Jinnah, quite early on after the independence, spotted Mr. Zahid Husain and mandated him to start working on formation of central bank, which would be called State Bank of Pakistan.
Under the visionary leadership of the Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Mr. Zahid Husain was entrusted with the task of creating the Central Bank of Pakistan. And I think this was a formidable task in those early days. He has done a remarkable job in putting in place the institutional framework, the legal framework, and also the required human resources, and this task was achieved in a remarkable short span of time.
Undaunted by these challenges, Zahid Husain led the establishment of the central bank. The Victoria Museum building was rented and refurbished, and on the 1st of July 1948, the State Bank of Pakistan was inaugurated by the father of the nation.
The opening of the State Bank of Pakistan symbolizes sovereignty of our state in the financial sphere. I need hardly dilate on the important role the State Bank will have to play in regulating the economic life of our country. Monetary policy of the bank will have a direct bearing on our trade and commerce, both inside Pakistan as well as with the outside world. And it is only to be desired that our policy should encourage maximum production and a free flow of trade.
From the onset, the State Bank of Pakistan faced a number of challenges. The division of assets was disputed by the Reserve Bank of India, and SBP faced severe restrictions on its access to the means and ways accounts. Zahid Husain led the special division, which ensured the promulgation of the State Bank of Pakistan Order of May 1948, as well as the amendment of the Pakistan Order of 1947 that required the Reserve Bank of India to cede its role in Pakistan on the 30th of June 1948. Besides this, there was a severe shortage of trained personnel, and the banking and financial system was in disarray. To address this gap, Zahid Husain laid special emphasis on skill development within the financial sector.
I think one of the key challenges in the early period of the Central Bank of Pakistan was to have a trained manpower, particularly in the fields of economics and banking and finance.
Another aspect of it, I think, which was also visionary, was his focus on training. He was very keen that we must train our own cadre, and that is why he established the Institute of Bankers Pakistan. We have now have our own training institute, which is NIBAF.
I would call that the highlight of his legacy, that State Bank has been able to continue with the emphasis on training and capacity building of the required human resources to carry forth the conduct of monetary policy and the development of the financial sector.
Zahid Husain's illustrious career did not culminate with the central bank. He went on to serve as the first chairman of the Taxation Inquiry Committee and the first chairman of the Planning Commission Board. It was in this capacity that he authored the country's first 5-year plan, delivering a blueprint for the development priorities of Pakistan.
Quality of the first 5-year plan and the second 5-year plan were superb, and a lot of other countries actually copied our plans, which were done during Mr. Zahid Husain's time, as the model for their own countries.
We have that copy. The entire 5-year plan, it is this thick. It was written by his hand. Every word was written by his hand. Entire, about 400 pages.
He did a remarkable job. Given the contrast that we have from then to today's market conditions are very, very divergent. I believe he was a pioneer and managed the economy extremely well. So I give a lot of credit to his foundation that he laid for the rest of us.
So State Bank has worked on a strategic plan, Vision 2028. As part of this plan, we have set number of strategic goals to be achieved by June 2028. And one of the key goals, for instance, is the achievement of the medium-term target of inflation. We have also focused on improving the effectiveness, fairness, and also competitiveness of the financial institutions which are regulated by us. And as part of the plan, we will also be focusing on improving access to finance, putting in place an infrastructure for the payment system, the micro payment gateway, which we have already established, which is called RAST. And recently we have also had a new upgraded system, Prism Plus. With the implementation of number of other initiatives as part of the Vision 2028, we will be able to take the central bank to a new stage, whereby it will be a modern, high-tech, people-centric central bank.
In recognition of this titan's contributions in diverse fields like education, banking and finance, taxation, development and diplomacy, the State Bank of Pakistan has established memorial chairs for economics at public sector universities. The Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture series was also launched as a platform where renowned international experts discuss emergent economic challenges and opportunities. Among prominent speakers who have taken the podium at this event are 2019 Nobel Economics Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee, former World Bank chief economist Anne Kruger, and Sir Paul Collier.
In the memory of Mr. Zahid Husain, the memorial lecture is conducted every year, and we invite a renowned professional in the field of economics to conduct these lectures. So today's lecture is also a continuation of that process, and I think it is contributing not only the training and capacity building of our own staff, but also the general public at large.
The State Bank of Pakistan welcomes you to this year's Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture Series. We appreciate your presence here as we pay homage to a titan and hope that this event continues to provide a platform for an informed discourse.
Over the decades, this lecture series has hosted some of the world's most influential economists, some of which include Irving Friedman, Stanley Fischer, and Abhijit Banerjee. This year, we are honored to have with us Dr. Amir Sufi from the University of Chicago, who will be speaking on the topic, the role of finance in the structural transformation of the economy. To formally introduce our distinguished guest and emphasize the importance of this flagship series, I would like to invite on stage Deputy Governor Salimullah to deliver the welcome address. Please join me in welcoming him.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. The respected members of Zahid Husain family, if any available here at the moment. Today's very distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Amir Sufi, the honorable former governors, particularly Yasin Sahab, and deputy governors, your excellencies, presidents of the banks and financial institutions, the financial industry, the media, academia, and the business community, ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon. It is my privilege and honor to welcome you all today and to host Dr. Sufi at the 25th Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture as we take up the vital subject of how financial development enables structural transformation of an economy. Before sharing my views on the importance of today's subject, although a bulk we have seen in the documentary as well, let us pause to remember and pay tribute to late Zahid Husain, the first governor of State Bank of Pakistan. As we are all aware, Pakistan confronted immense challenges in the immediate aftermath of independence. The moment demanded creation of a stable and trustworthy financial system capable of supporting a newly independent nation. Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah entrusted Mr. Hussain with the crucial responsibility of laying the foundation of the nation's central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan. History bears witness to the fact, under Mr. Hussein's exemplary leadership, the State Bank of Pakistan played a pivotal role in the nation's early economic revival. Even today, his tenure stands as a benchmark of professional excellence and institutional integrity. To honor this enduring legacy, the State Bank instituted the Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture series way back in 1973. The series serves as a fitting tribute to Mr. Hussain by carrying forward his spirit of intellectual rigor and advancing informed discourse on issues of central importance to the economy. Many eminent economists, as we have seen in the documentary as well, including the Nobel laureate, Professor Abhijit Banerjee, Dr. Stanley Fisher, Dr. Anne Kruger, Dr. Hollis Chandry, and Professor Charles Kindleberger have delivered lectures at this august forum. Ladies and gentlemen, on this note, let me introduce the eminent speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Amir Sufi. Dr. Amir Sufi is the Bruce Lindsay Distinguished Service Professor of Economics, Finance, and Public Policy at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And Dr. Sufi earned his PhD in economics from very, very reputed MIT in 2005. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics and Research and co-director of its research program, the National Bureau of Economics Research Program on Corporate Finance. He was elected as a fellow of the Econometric Society in 2022 and as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science in 2024. His book, House of Debt, needs no introduction. The book offers convincing answers to some of the most important questions facing the modern economy. Why do severe recessions take place? Could we have prevented the Great Recession and its consequences? And what actions are needed to prevent such crises going forward? His expertise lies within the fields of finance and macroeconomics, and he is currently researching the topics related to intangible capital and corporate finance. Professor Sufi was awarded the 2017 Fisher Black Prize by the American Finance Association. His work has been published in reputed journals like American Economic Review, Econometrica, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Financial Economics, Journal of Economic Perspectives, and the Journal of Finance. Moreover, IMF has included him among the 25 economists under the age of 25 who are leading the intellectual discourse on the global economy. We are really, really proud to have you here, Mr. Sufi. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me give some of the thoughts on today's topic. And the topic is the role of finance in driving the structural transformation of economy, a topic that is both timely and essential. As you know, that despite a challenging global and domestic environment, with prudent macroeconomic policies, both on the fiscal and the monetary side, we have been able to stabilize the economy. Our focus is on achieving higher and sustainable growth for a considerably long period of time to improve the well-being of our people, particularly the people at the lower segment of the society, people at the lower income levels. This requires this sustainable growth. This requires deep-rooted economic reforms to address structural weaknesses in our economy. This would also require a financial system that is adaptive, innovation-friendly, and aligned with the national development objectives. Yet, when we see and have a look at the overall financial landscape, it gives sort of a disconcerting paradox. Despite a very robust and profitable banking system, Pakistan's financial intermediation remains well below the regional benchmarks. With private sector credit at only 8.7% of GDP, banks remain risk averse, favoring government securities over the real economy. Although it's not only the fault and weakness lies at the banking system, but also the very huge and continuously rising fiscal deficit needs of the government that are being met by the banking system. That is also to be blamed. And this systemic inertia limits capital for private sector generally, and SMEs and agriculture sector particularly, which are vital for sustained and inclusive growth. Restricted credit flows to these strategically important sectors have profound socioeconomic implications. Financial inclusion is therefore not a peripheral, it is a critical imperative. Our journey towards sustainable growth will remain incomplete if youth, women, and small and medium-sized businesses continues to face limited access to finance. Expanding credit and finance access is essential to promote self-employment, micro-entrepreneurship, and longer-term sustainability and national resilience. Recognizing this, my apologies, State Bank has intensified its efforts to increase financing to SMEs and agriculture sector, promote financial inclusion, as well as gender diversity and financial literacy. To improve the business case for banks and for SME and agriculture financing, we have introduced risk-sharing facilities. And the objective was that the overall business case for the banks could be improved for enabling them to build their exposure in SME and agriculture finance. So the government, based on the recommendation of the central bank, introduced that risk sharing facility so that the risk appetite could be of the banks for building their exposures in the SME sector could be enhanced. And that provides about 10 to 20% of first loss coverage to the banks against their fresh exposures to these priority sectors. Similarly, the National Financial Inclusion Policy that we have launched last year, it envisages that we will be increasing the financial inclusion levels to 75% and minimizing the gender gap to 25%. Currently, they are hovering around the inclusion level around 65%, and the gender gap is around 32% at the moment. The landmark Banking on Equality initiative improved women's participation in the financial sector and the national economy, enhancing their access to banking services and entrepreneurial finance. We have also taken decisive steps to foster innovation, enhance digital adoption, and broaden the financial access. Recently, we had announced the regulatory sandbox that allows fintechs and technology-driven startups to test their solutions in a controlled environment, accelerating innovation in payments, remittances, and digital financial services. The enabling and robust digital financial infrastructure, including RAST, which is our first instant payment system, and then the eKYC framework that we have introduced, and digital onboarding, these have laid the foundations for more inclusive financial ecosystem. However, let me say this, that financing to the technologically driven startups and such institutions requires more collaborative approach. It requires collaboration between banks, rather the commercial banks, the capital markets, and the NBFCs like the venture capital companies and the private equity firms. Innovative firms often rely on intangible assets and rapid growth cycles that do not suit traditional collateral-based lending. Venture capital and private equity can provide early-stage risk capital, mentorship, and governance support, while commercial banks can complement these efforts with working capital, export financing, and growth stage credit. Leveraging SAP's enabling framework, such as digital onboarding, alternative credit scoring pilots and models, and sandbox tested innovative solutions, banks can confidently serve emerging tech ecosystem. A collaborative model in which venture capital funds early stage startups and bank supports the firms as they mature can create a strong pipeline of high productivity firms and new exporters. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we hope that today Dr. Sufi would be sharing his insights with us on breaking the cycle of low credit penetration and institutional risk aversion. Our objective is to understand how finance can drive not only corporate growth, but also equitable economic development, ensuring that the benefits of transformation reaches to all segments of society. With this, Dr. Sufi, we look forward to hearing from you for your deep insights. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great honor to be here. Let me start by thanking the Deputy Governor for that very kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be here in Karachi with such a distinguished set of people who know far more about the world than I do. So I'm going to do my best to give you some insights into the economy overall. I thought I would begin by telling you a little bit more about myself. So my parents migrated from Pakistan to the United States in the 1960s. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I grew up in Topeka, Kansas. And those of you who know America know that Michigan and Kansas are about as heartland America as you can get. And so I am definitely quite American, but I'm extremely proud of my Pakistani heritage. My parents, in fact, met at Dow Medical College right down the street, now Dow University. And so they were extremely proud to hear that I was giving a lecture so close to their alma mater. And I was honored to hear very recently that my wife, who actually grew up in Abu Dhabi but was born in Karachi, Pakistan, her maternal grandfather actually worked directly for Zahid Husain Saab. And I think it's just an incredible testament to his courage to be able to start the State Bank of Pakistan in such a tumultuous time. So again, it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to be talking about finance and structural transformation of the economy, an intangible question. And that's going to be the theme of the lecture that I'm going to move through today. I want to start with the idea of benevolent finance in a world of constant change. A Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, all the way back in 500 before the Common Era, had a philosophy based on the following idea, that the only constant in life is change. We have a very similar idea in the Islamic tradition, where we believe that God, in his infinite wisdom, creates and recreates in every instant. And so what we're seeing in every instant is constant change. And of course, that constant change of creation points to the permanence of the creator. An economist also that is very famous for thinking a lot about change and how important it is was Joseph Schumpeter. Many of you may know his very famous expression, creative destruction. This idea that industries, that firms are in constant flux, and that's just the way the economy works. Joseph Schumpeter also talked prominently about finance and the role of finance in facilitating that change. And I always love this quote where he says, the banker, and he really means the broader financial sector, stands between those who wish to form new combinations and the possessor of productive means, the possessors of money, of capital. He is essentially a phenomenon of development, and I love this last line. He makes possible the carrying out of new combinations. So the message I have today is that a successful financial system needs to be able to embrace change. It facilitates the transition of economies into higher productivity and growth. In more detail, if the nature of production changes, and I'm going to be making the argument that the nature of production has in fact changed a lot over the last 30 to 40 years, then the financial sector's role is likely to change as well. And some financial arrangements are going to be better suited than others when such structural transformation occurs. And the central thesis I'm going to put forward to you today, based on some research I've been doing, that as capital becomes more intangible, the financial system must change to start prioritizing claims on what I call the continuation value of businesses. And I'm going to go through this in more detail to explain exactly what all of this means. So I don't like surprises, so I'm just going to lay out exactly what I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through 3 points. So when you leave today, I'm hoping you remember these 3 core points of the lecture. First, high-income economies have been transforming into the producers of high-tech services. What I mean by that is information services and professional scientific and technical services. 2, high-tech services, the nature of investment in these businesses is customer capital and knowledge capital, meaning intangible capital. 3, intangible capital is very difficult to finance with traditional asset-based loans. Instead, things like cash flow-based loans and equity financing, such as venture capital and private equity, become key to financing this part of the economy. This is based on underlying research I've been doing with a number of colleagues. I have 2 fantastic PhD students at Booth, Bianca He and Lauren Mostrom. We've written 2 papers together. Young-Soo Jang is at Penn State. He's a former PhD student. Da-Sol Kim is at the US Treasury in the Office of Financial Research. And Martine Aragoneses is at INSEAD in France. So if you want more details, you can just look up my website and go into these. So I'm just going to be doing an overview of these research articles. All right, let's jump in. First point, when you're thinking about the US economy and you're thinking about the world economy, you should be thinking about economy moving towards high-tech services. I'm going to show you this in the context of the literature on structural transformation. So we've used that term a few times. What does it actually mean? Structural transformation is the literature in economics that focuses on the industrial structure of a country as it progresses into becoming a higher and higher income country. And the general consensus in this literature is that countries start primarily focusing on agriculture. They then graduate to manufacturing as they become richer. And then finally, the richest countries tend to focus a lot of their energy and production on services. Okay, so that's kind of well known, and I'm just going to show you some results that confirm that. Here's a quote from a handbook chapter that kind of summarizes this literature. And you can see from the quote, first, the share of hours worked and nominal added value for agriculture tend to decrease with the level of development, whereas the shares for services tend to increase with the level of development. Manufacturing tends to be more of a hump-shaped. Low-income countries, high-income countries do less manufacturing, and countries in between tend to do more manufacturing. So just to confirm that result, I want to show you some analysis we did, my team of research assistants, that basically shows you some scatter plots to see that this is really a credible result in the literature. So the kind of pictures I'm going to show you, let's look at this one just as an example. Pakistan is not in these pictures, but I'll show you Pakistan in a few slides just to make sure you have the context. Here we're plotting for agriculture the share of value added, or the share of GDP, on the vertical axis, against, on the horizontal axis, a measure of the income of the country, which is GDP per capita in US dollars after adjusting for purchase price parity. Okay? What you should all see from this picture, and should probably not be surprising, is there is a very striking negative correlation between income and the share of production that goes to agriculture. Shouldn't be that surprising, right? As a country gets richer and richer, fewer and fewer of the resources are devoted toward agriculture and more start moving toward manufacturing and services. Let's look at mining and manufacturing. So there you see not such a clear relationship. And again, you have a lot of variation across countries in how much they focus on manufacturing. If you look at energy, water, and construction, which oftentimes people think of as kind of associated with manufacturing, you again see a bit of a negative correlation here. My focus today, however, is on the service industry. And one of the main points I want to make here that I do think is more new to the literature is that I think we need to stop treating all services as one sector. Okay? Services is actually made up of very different kinds of businesses, right? So we're all here in the Marriott. The Marriott, the value add of the Marriott, the service staff here, will be in accommodation and food services, right? Which I'm going to call a low-tech service industry, okay? If we go over to Dolman Mall, go to Jaffergy's, right? There, the employees, the retail employees, again, household-facing low-tech services. That's very different than what I would call high-tech services. And here I'm talking about information and communication and professional scientific and technical activities. And if you want it in your head, just to make sure you understand what these industries are, information services is going to include Alphabet, the parent of Google, Microsoft, Oracle. If you want to make it local to to Pakistan, think about NetSol. If you're thinking about basically professional scientific and technical services, you're thinking of business consulting, engineering consulting, Accenture, McKinsey. Those are going to be fitting into what I call the high-tech services. If you want an example from Pakistan, Systems Limited is definitely a professional scientific and technical services company. Okay? Why is it important to separate services into these four categories? Because you're going to start seeing very different relationships when it comes to structural transformation when you do so. Okay, so first let's look at finance and real estate. This is a very well-known result. As countries become richer, more and more of the economic activity is focused on finance and real estate. Shouldn't be surprising. You know, New York City is in the United States, London is in the United Kingdom. Most of the main financial capitals of the world are in pretty high-income countries. Okay? However, if you take out finance and real estate, you actually see pretty much a flat relationship, which I would argue kind of contradicts the standard narrative that high-income countries all move towards services. Okay? The problem with that argument is that it's not separating high-tech and low-tech services, which is what I'm doing on this slide. So if you look at the picture on the right, and this is going to be one of my main points today, that if you take high-tech services, information and communication, professional scientific and technical services, you see a very strong positive relationship between income. As countries get richer, more of the economic activity is focused on these high-tech service-oriented businesses. And the differences are really quite striking. In the United States, in the Netherlands, in France, 20% of GDP is in these high-tech service-oriented businesses. Okay? In contrast, if you look at low-tech businesses, low-tech service businesses, you see a very striking negative correlation. And so we're mixing things up when we group these two together. And it's very important to understand that when we're thinking of structural transformation. Now, of course, I'm only using averages over the last 10 years here. I'm a data guy, so I want to show you robustness. Of course, we have 40 years of annual data, and so I can show you the full data, and you'll see just how powerful this relationship is. Okay? So the first main point of this lecture is to show you that as countries get richer, they focus more and more on high-tech services. To really drill this point home, let me show you the largest 10 information service companies in the United States. Okay? A lot of household names are up here. Alphabet is the parent of Google, Microsoft. When you think, if you live here in Pakistan and you're thinking about what US goods and services you consume, I would argue that probably a lot of it is coming from this list, right? Software, internet search. These are the information services, the powerhouse of the US economy. If you look at professional scientific and technical activities, this is a bit more of a mixed bag. Accenture's up there, you know, a management consulting business. McKinsey would be up there. It's a privately traded, it's a private company. You can think about Booz Allen, also a consulting company. A lot of these are like engineering consulting firms, technical service firms, and again, they're a huge part of the US economy. Now, why is this so important for thinking about the global economy? Because if you look over time at the high-income countries, here I'm focusing on 11 high-income countries that I have the data for back all the way to 1970. Unfortunately, for a lot of the emerging economies, we don't have the data going that far back. You can see a pattern that's been very well known, which is services as a share of GDP has been going up over time. Finance and real estate and manufacturing has been going down. Of course, being from the United States, the fact that manufacturing has been going down has created some political issues for us, but this is undeniable that this has been the pattern in the data. However, I would argue that even this is a bit misleading because I think that red line on services, once you split out into high-tech and low-tech services, you kind of really see what's going on. Okay? Low-tech services, household-facing retail, wholesale, it's basically flat over the last 50 years. At about 20% of GDP. And instead, it's really the growth in high-tech services that is driving economic change globally and especially in these high-income economies. Here's the data for the United States, just to show you that it's quite robust across countries, and I'll have a little bit more to say about the US economy in a few slides. Now, most of this talk is going to be focused on economies in Europe and the United States, and I think we're going to talk about Pakistan quite a bit in the Q&A, but I did want to just show you where Pakistan fits in this overall picture, okay? So here I'm taking data that's produced by the State Bank of Pakistan on the shares of GDP in the different industries in Pakistan relative to the OECD and the EU CLEMS. And perhaps not surprising to people in this room, there's a much larger share of economic activity in Pakistan generated by agriculture relative to the European and the American economies. There's also, which was a bit surprising to me, there's also quite a bit more focused on low-tech services, okay? If we look at the industries I've been talking about, information services, to be frank here, Pakistan kind of punches above its weight. For its per capita GDP, it actually has a reasonably high share of economic activity information services. That's going to be a key point that I think we're going to address both in the Q&A and I'm going to return to as we talk through the slides. Professional, scientific, and technical services is actually in this bottom category, and it's grouped, and so I can't break that out separately. But my hunch is that it is quite a bit smaller than it would be in Europe and in the US. So hopefully that first point is quite clear, that if you're going to understand where the world economy is going, you have to understand these two types of businesses: information and communication, professional and scientific technical services. Okay? The second part of my presentation is going to be focusing on what really is investment in these industries. Okay? So I want to show a little bit of math. Those of you who have ever done any economics training, especially at the PhD level, a paper we all learn is a famous paper by Fumio Hayashi on investment. What is the determination of investment? And we usually write down this value function, okay? And the value of the company is a function of its present discounted value profits, and those profits depend on the capital stock, right? How much capital it has. That capital evolves according to an equation, which is investment plus the depreciated value of capital, okay? So I remember being in graduate school and thinking, I was a finance guy from the beginning, so I'm doing my PhD and I was like, oh, well, the most interesting question is, how do firms finance that investment? Do they use bank loans? Do they use equity? Do they use venture capital? I've always fascinated with that question, and I'm still fascinated with it 25 years later. But now I've started to think that we need to take a step back even from that basic question, which is the key question isn't how firms finance investment. The key question is, what really is investment? And when you think about that question, all of us kind of think of investment as being obvious. Oh, we invest in property, plants, and equipment, we buy new machines, we buy land, and then it creates a durable asset that then produces output going forward. But I don't think you can think like that when you're thinking of these businesses in information services and in professional, scientific, and technical services. You have to think much more differently about what investment really is. And that's been the heart of the research I've been doing over the last couple of years. So let me walk through one of the papers that we wrote. So in one of the papers, we really tried to carefully measure what firms say they invest in. The advent of large language models and artificial intelligence techniques has really boosted our ability in research to measure what firms are doing. So we were able to extract for a set of publicly traded US firms exactly how much they spend on sales and marketing and R&D. And for the accountants in the room, you'll know that R&D and sales and marketing are not counted as investments in accounting statements. They are counted as expenses, usually contained within the sales general administrative expense, okay? I would argue that that's a mistake, that they're not expenses actually. We should be thinking of them as investments, okay? So what we did is we capitalized those values to get a stock of intangible capital. And what we show basically is that sales and marketing expense should be treated like customer capital, and R&D expense should be treated as knowledge capital. And that these expenditures are not simply a cost of doing business, but you should think of them as investments in building valuable capital. Now, you might say, that sounds really nice. How do we actually show it? So let me tell you how we show it to try to convince you of this argument. We basically have two strategies. One is we look at the enterprise value to physical capital ratio of different industries. Let me talk a little bit about that. It should be quite intuitive. In the Hayashi model, the enterprise value of the company, which we can measure quite well because these are all publicly traded firms, should never be too far above the physical capital that the company employs, if physical capital is the only input into production. And the intuition's pretty clear, right? If there's more and more value, the market's telling you to invest more, and so you should boost your physical capital ratio to make sure that happens. Okay? So what we do is we basically look across industries in the United States, and we show that systematically the enterprise value to physical capital ratio is much higher in industries that have more sales and marketing and R&D. Meaning the sales and marketing and R&D are creating some kind of capital that the market is valuing very highly. So that's the first way we try to prove this point. The second way we try to prove this point is by focusing on a very clever thing that we have available into the United States, and that's what are called purchase price allocations. So here's basically how it works. A purchase price allocation is when a publicly traded company buys another company, they have to delineate the exact sources of value of what they're paying for. So in that list are things like customer relationships, customer lists, research and technology. So then we can take a company that's been spending a lot on sales and marketing, and we can show that when that company is bought by another company, that company pays a lot for customer lists and customer relationships. That is, we can directly link the expenses on sales and marketing to the value created by those through customer lists, brands, and trademarks. So both those ways, I think we've done a convincing job of basically showing that these expenditures should be thought of as investments and not just expenses. If you've ever known anyone starting a software business or doing kind of consulting, I mean, a lot of their time is spent on pitching the product to customers and trying to get customers to subscribe to the service. Once those subscriptions are signed, that becomes a valuable asset of the company, and therefore that expenditure you made on the sales force was in fact an investment, not simply a cost of doing business. So, hopefully I've convinced you that you should be thinking of sales and marketing and R&D as investments, not just capital expenditures. So why is this important for the first part of the presentation? Because I'm going to show you that information services and professional scientific and technical activities are primarily focused on these types of investments. So let's take a look at the data. So if we look at capital expenditures for these two industries, the two industries that have been growing the most over time, you can see that they actually don't spend that much in capital expenditures. All of these are annual expenses scaled by the total capital stock, okay? So these two industries only spend about 2 percentage points of their capital stock every year on CapEx, right? So you might say, well, how are they worth so much if they're not even investing much? If you compare them to other industries, you can see they're substantially lower. So for example, agriculture, mining, they're spending more like 4 to 10% on their capital stock every year. So what are these guys doing? What are information services and professional scientific and technical services doing? They're spending huge amounts on sales and marketing and on R&D. Information services is stunning. Every year they're spending almost 15 percentage points of their capital stock on sales and marketing and R&D. So what I would argue is what they're doing is building their customer capital and building their knowledge capital, and that's really where their value comes from. If you look at every other industry, almost none of them are even close. You know, most of them spend almost nothing. Manufacturing is actually kind of interesting because they do spend there. That's mostly driven by high-tech manufacturing. So think medical equipment manufacturing or computer and peripheral equipment manufacturing. Those companies actually do spend a lot of R&D and a lot on sales and marketing. So then you can capitalize these expenses and you can get a fraction of the total capital stock by industry that is intangible. And when you do that, you see stunning numbers, right? For these two industries, 75% of their total capital stock is actually intangible, right? If you look at every other industry, it's much lower. So these two industries that are growing the most in the global economy are also the ones that focus most on intangible capital. So what is the main lesson for the financial sector? That's the last part of the presentation. So a core argument that comes from the corporate finance literature is that financial intermediaries are only going to be willing to lend up to the liquidation value of the capital, okay? Meaning you have to have really good hard collateral that can be redeployed to another business if you default in order to raise the financing in the first place, right? So if you look at the data for Pakistan, for example, land is a very commonly formed use of collateral for loans. Why? Because land can be seized and redeployed very easily. Nobel laureate Oliver Hart sums this up very nicely in his 1995 book. Creditors will be willing to lend only up to the value of the assets that they can seize in the event of default. This argument is confirmed in many settings. Small and middle market firms without tangible redeployable assets have a lot of difficulty raising bank financing. As economies evolve and their economies become more intangible, banks tend to reduce how much commercial and industrial lending they're doing, and instead they switch into construction and real estate. So let me show you some pictures that kind of show this. So this is from research by Dye, Mueller, and Werner. And this is a really nice paper that has data from across the spectrum. So high income, low income countries. They're not only showing you value add and employment, but now you can also see credit, those blue squares. And you can see kind of predictably, as countries get richer, the share of total bank credit going to agriculture also falls. That's very intuitive. Less of the economy is in agriculture, so less of the bank credit. Manufacturing also falls very dramatically. So if the banks aren't doing manufacturing and they're not doing agriculture, what are they doing? And this picture shows you that a huge amount is going towards construction and real estate. This is true in the United States, it's true in most European economies. So banks, even though the economy is moving to intangible capital industries, the banks aren't really moving with them, right? So these intangible capital industries are gonna need to find financing from some other source because banks are just not really in the business of financing intangible capital industries. This is a paper by a group of IMF authors, which I really like, that basically focuses on different regions within the United States and shows that as the region becomes more intangible capital intensive, think the Bay Area in San Francisco, where you have a lot of information services, they show that the banks reduce how much commercial and industrial lending they're doing, and instead they switch into mortgages, right? So again, banks just don't seem to want to be able to finance these intangible capital industries. So here's the key lesson. Intangible capital is not easily redeployable in case of firm failure. Think about a software business that goes bankrupt, right? What are you going to grab if you're a creditor? There's not going to be any customers left. There's not going to be any liquidation value, right? Unsurprisingly, asset-based bank loans are not really an option in these industries. Instead, I want to talk about two financial instruments that have been developing that are better suited for financing these intangible capital industries. One is what is called cash flow-based lending. The key in cash flow-based lending is, in the United States, banks really don't do it as much. It's mostly by a new intermediary called private credit and direct lending. They've been doing a lot of cash flow-based lending. And the key difference is the creditor, if there's a default, doesn't try to liquidate the company. They instead intend to take over the company. That can work, right? And even if your company's intangible, as long as you keep the company together and you don't try to separate it for parts, it can still be worth a lot, right? The other main option, of course, is doing equity financing for middle market firms. And that's really critical, because now think about the problem if you're trying to finance these businesses. If you want to finance the business and you know if things go badly, it's worth nothing, which is true of most intangible capital firms, then you better get something if things go well, right? That means you need an equity claim on the business because, of course, debt's not going to pay you a lot if things go well. And that's the logic by which I think you should think of venture capital and private equity growth happening. If you ask me, venture capital and private equity are following these economies because they know these intangible capital industries need outside equity financing. So developing private credit, developing private equity, developing venture capital is going to be crucial as the world economy becomes more and more intangible. Let me show you some evidence from a second paper. In this paper, we were able to, for a set of private middle market firms, so these are all private firms, not publicly traded, we were able to link them to whether they received a venture capital investment, a private equity investment, or a loan from a bank. And what I'm showing you here is the portfolio shares of the venture capitalist, the private equity, and the bank by industry. So this column adds up to 1, right? So this is what industries are most represented in the portfolios of venture capital, private equity, and banks. And what you can see, it's really quite stunning. More than 50% of the venture capital portfolio is focused on these two industries we've been talking about, right? For private equity, it's about 30%. For banks, it's only 13%. So again, the evidence suggests that banks are just not going to be as willing to finance these industries, and so private equity and venture capital become the dominant players when we're thinking about the growth in this industry. So what are the policy lessons? A central policy lesson that I want to emphasize today here is if you're going to have an economy move more into intangible capital sectors, you're going to have great institutions, because both cash flow-based loans and venture capital and private equity require complicated, complex legal contracts that need to be able to be enforced in a court of law. I'll give you a quick example. A good friend, a former MBA student, came back to get some advice from some of his former professors. He had started a software business, and it had become quite successful. And it was financed with a direct loan from a private credit fund, not from a bank. And it was a healthcare software company, okay? And in the healthcare industry in the US and in most countries, a lot of that's government-backed. So the government made some changes to some of the government Medicare and Medicaid in the US that meant that half of his customers went bankrupt right away, okay? And you can imagine what happened to his business. Half of his customers are gone. He can't pay back the loan. So he came to us for advice. What should I do? Am I going to lose my business? And it turns out what he did was exactly what this kind of modeling framework tells you should do. He went back to the direct lender. He basically said, look, I've lost half my customers. I still think I have a good business. I can grow it, but I obviously can't pay you back your loan. I don't have the money. So here's what I propose. We wipe out the old equity holders, right? They don't get paid anything. I make you the new equity holders. You retain me as the CEO, and we just continue the business. And the direct lender said, sounds good to us. Let's do it, right? That's what I mean by having a cash flow-based loans that preserves the continuation value of the business. The direct lenders aren't going to liquidate that business. It's not worth anything liquidated. And you've got to have a good bankruptcy system to make sure you can do that kind of thing. Likewise, if you look at venture capital contracts, private equity, these are very complicated, complex contracts. And so institutional development is even more important when capital is intangible. Now, I know the economy in Pakistan is more, especially the export sector, is more concentrated in agriculture and textiles. So, of course, the lessons of intangible capital are less important in those sectors. But as many of you know, IT services is doing reasonably well in Pakistan, about 10% of exports. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. And so I do think that these lessons are relevant for Pakistan. that if you're going to have enough growth in IT services, then you're going to have the kinds of institutions that can support this kind of cash flow-based lending and venture capital and private equity. And I know that's a steep challenge, but it's just something that I think is a main lesson from the research I'm presenting here. So let me conclude. We need to embrace change because the economy is rapidly changing, as it always does. That's the nature of the world. It changes. Financing arrangements must facilitate such change to ensure prosperity. Finance as a source of prosperity requires great institutions, even more so in a world of intangible capital. And with that, let me just say thank you for the honor of being able to deliver this lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Sufi, for a very insightful lecture. We now move on to the fireside chat session. This moderated conversation will explore Dr. Sufi's ideas further and connect them to Pakistan's economic and financial landscape. So before we proceed, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this discussion. Mr. Abid Qamar is currently the director of the Agriculture Credit and Financial Inclusion Department, and he has previously also directed the SME and Housing Finance Department and the Research Department. He has provided expert contributions in microfinance, financial inclusion, and macroeconomic policy. So may I please invite Dr. Amir Sufi and Mr. Abid Qamar to take the stage.
Test, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So we have, and thank you, Dr. Amir, for your very insightful and thought-provoking your research has shed some very important light on the modern economies, how they are transforming in this new world and with this intangible capital, and why the financing models must evolve accordingly. So during your lecture, you mentioned about why sales and marketing or R&D should be taken as an investment. So just taking cue from that point, so the result of sales and marketing investment is that ends as the brand value. And for many of the tech firms, the brand value is their biggest asset. So for instance, like Apple's brand value alone, that was valued at over $2 trillion in 2023. And similarly, the R&D's value, in case of IBM, they hold like more than 140,000 patents. And that is basically a key part of their knowledge capital. And similarly, if you look at the S&P 500 firms, 90% of their market value comes from the intangible. So that's the real value, how the world, the modern world is moving towards. Also, it is said that the organizational capital, you also mentioned about the organizational capital. So IT infrastructure, that matters. And it is said that companies who invest in, for instance, like cloud or AI, so they are likely to have 30% more productivity. So that throws some light on what is the value of all these tangible assets. In short, customer capital, that wins markets. Knowledge capital, that drives innovation. And organizational capital, that actually keeps things running smoothly in the organization. So in this chat now, of course, we have heard about the modern economies. Now, what it means for the emerging economies like Pakistan, where both the financial system and the technology ecosystem is evolving and are at an important turning point. So we are going to explore now more from the perspective of emerging economies in this chat now. So coming to the first question, let me begin with this broad global landscape. You showed compelling evidence that services sectors have become the backbone of these modern economies. Not only the services sectors, but the high-tech services sectors there. While these developed countries, these have reached to that point, the emerging economies are still at quite distance from, in terms of like the development of the high-tech services. So still there is a huge gap. And if they do not invest or do not move in that direction, this gap is actually going to widen further. So my question is that given this global transition, so what should be the policy priorities for an emerging economy like Pakistan for a structural shift towards intangible capital-intensive industries to ensure that it is not left behind in the global race for this adoption?
Thank you so much, Abid Saab, for this excellent question. Very clearly, most of my research focuses on Europe and the United States. So I want to begin by just noting with a note of humility that the people in this room know far more about Pakistan than I do. So I have a bit of an outsider's perspective. But I do think that the central lesson of the lecture is very applicable to all countries, including Pakistan. And that is, finance must facilitate the transition of savings into productive business investment. It sounds so obvious when you say it, but I think it's important to make sure we always understand that that is a central goal of the financial sector, to transform savings into productive business investment. And so before I talk about intangible capital specifically, the Deputy Governor gave some excellent remarks on where Pakistan is, where it should go, and I think I want to just echo some of those thoughts, which is, as you all know, in Pakistan, the investment to GDP ratio is lower than comparable countries. And the private sector credit to GDP ratio is lower than comparable countries. And so I think from a policy perspective, it's very important in Pakistan for us to uncover the exact reasons why SMEs interact less with the banking sector than they do, for example, in comparable economies like Bangladesh or India. We talked a little bit about this at dinner last night, and I think it's a fascinating question because there's a lot of potential explanations on the table. One you hear is that, oh, the banks just hold government debt, and that's why they don't lend to the private sector. Another explanation you hear is, well, the private sector doesn't want to formalize for tax reasons, and so they don't want to take a loan. Another explanation you hear is that it's cultural, that SMEs in Pakistan just don't like to interact with banks. Maybe they have an aversion from debt coming from the Islamic culture. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that figuring the answer to this question out will guide policy to a great degree. So to the degree I can offer a suggestion as an outsider, I think research into this question, why it is that SMEs precisely do not interact with the banking sector extensively, is going to be an important part of the overall strategy of implementing policies to facilitate more growth from the financial sector. Now, specifically on intangible capital. As I mentioned in the talk, one of the fascinating things about Pakistan is that it definitely punches way above its weight in its production of IT services. Together with India and Bangladesh, it seems that there is a huge amount of talent in this country for doing IT services. And we talked about IT services as being the #1 intangible capital industry. So of course, as you all know better than I do, these two companies, NetSol and Systems Limited, are fascinating examples that grew out of Pakistan, grew up in Pakistan. And I'll tell you, even those businesses, if you look at their history, almost never relied to a great degree on bank debt. So that just tells you that there's nothing unique about Pakistan or America on this point. Intangible capitalist businesses are just generally not going to rely on bank debt. There's a huge number of freelancers, as many of you know, that are driving, exports to a great degree. 10% of exports in the past year were IT services. And that's just a really promising spot for growth. So I would say from a policy perspective, I'm not a big fan of industrial policy or subsidizing industries, but I think figuring out if there are impediments for the IT services industry to continue to grow, figuring out exactly what financial intermediaries can help IT services grow further by financing this kind of intangible capital, I think that would be a primary goal from a policy perspective, in my opinion.
Great. So, thank you, Dr. Amir. So this brings to the second question, these intangible assets, these are invisible. These we cannot find in the accounting frameworks. So, and that is a challenge that the policymakers or even the banks, they find that how to collateralize them. And this is an important consideration. So how should the policymakers and regulators, they should think about measuring these intangibles, capital, so that the financial markets could lend to them more confidently?
Yeah, this is a great question. I guess I have 3 words to answer it. Accounting, accounting, and accounting. I think having really good accounting systems is absolutely crucial to the success of intangible capital industries. To give you an example, we wrote this paper where about 55% of publicly traded US firms break out their SG&A, their sales general administrative expense, into a sales and marketing line, an R&D line, and then in other expenses. Only 55%. The other 45% do not do that, and so we had to use the text to try to help us. So the Financial Stability, or the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, as we call it in the United States, they are now mandating, it's very interesting, they're noticing that SG&A, this line item, just to make sure everyone knows the accounting, right? It goes revenue minus cost of goods sold minus SG&A, and then you have basically operating profit, okay? So these are the 3 critical things you've got to measure well. Revenue, cost of goods sold, SG&A. In the United States, because of intangible capital, SG&A is going up, shooting up as a share of revenue over time. And I would argue that's exactly because intangible capital is more important, and the SG&A line is where those investments are. So FASB in the United States just passed 2 years ago a standards review where they said firms need to detail what's in SG&A in more detail because it's too opaque. We don't know exactly what they're spending. There's a big difference between sales, general expense, which is like rent, and if you're hiring an elite Salesforce team of engineers who are going out and selling. Those are two very different things. And so I think the key to this is accounting. And I know Pakistan has adopted the International Financial Reporting Standards system for the publicly traded companies. That's, of course, a great step in the right direction. I will say that some of the accountants, though, do complain that sales and marketing and R&D still count as expenses in accounting statements and not as investments. And so for that reason, there has been some discussion about whether to change that. But I think having the best accounting standards possible will facilitate venture capital, private equity, outside investors if they can see exactly what these companies are doing with their expenses.
Great. So coming to, as a follow-up question of the first question, our Deputy Governor also mentioned that our economies now need to move forward and move to more technology-based and information system-based economy. So, and your whole focus is also on the high-tech services. So here the practical question, particularly in a country like ours, is that how can the banks, they can practically transition to lending models that better support these digital and IT firms?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's difficult. I think the evidence in the United States is that even in a country like the United States, which arguably has the best financial environment in terms of contracting, judiciary, even there, banks generally will not lend as much as I showed you to intangible capital industries such as information services, such as IT, such as consulting. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. In the United States, in my opinion, private equity financed with direct lending and private capital has been the driving force behind that industry, together with venture capital. And so the question is, can those kinds of intermediaries develop in Pakistan? It's a challenge for sure. There are venture capital firms in Pakistan. There are private equity firms in Pakistan. It's still a very small part of the overall financial sector. But just to make this very tangible, this was a discussion we had earlier at the State Bank, which I thought was a great discussion. Imagine you have all these freelancers, and they're all making decent amounts of money exporting to companies in the US. Probably all of them need to professionalize, and they need capital in order to grow. They need both of those things. They need professional advice, and they need capital. I will tell you, that is exactly what venture capital firms in the United States do. Venture capital firms in the United States, a lot of people think they're about management, and a lot of people think they're about financing. They're both right. They're both about both. They're about management and professionalizing services, and they're also about raising capital. So again, I'm an outsider. You know far more about Pakistan than I do, but there is a question in my mind in this specific sector, in IT, is there an ability for a financial intermediary to raise capital and go out and potentially find 5 or 6 really promising freelancers and form a business and have it grow and have it professionalize? My guess is if that happens, there are no banks involved. And that's how it's developed in the United States. That's how it's developed in Europe. And so for a bank-centric economy like Pakistan, it's clearly a challenge, but I think it's a challenge worth considering.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amir. So now we can open the floor for more questions, if there's any question. So before we start that, I'll only request that please keep your questions short and your comment as short as possible. So
Assalamu alaikum. So you mentioned this developed economies. Some of those trends have been questioned by Chinese model. They've grown manufacturing as well as this high-tech services, the high-valued services you are saying. So is there a lesson for Pakistan, or is this just aberration because it's a centrally controlled economy?
Great question. So I don't know the Chinese data as well as I know the US and Europe. I would say that China, despite the news and despite some promising trends, I would say they're still lagging pretty far behind in these two industries. In fact, if you want to talk about high-tech manufacturing, yes, they have definitely made major strides there. But in information services, in managerial, professional, and technical activities, I would still say they have chosen a model which is more about driving manufacturing at all costs. It's a very interesting question because I will tell you, there is an entire literature in trade that argues if you look at supply chains for companies, that the value add is actually what they call a smile. Okay? So let me explain that. Has anyone heard this theory of the smile in the value chain, right? So the smile in the value chain means that the real value in any supply chain is in design at the beginning, and it's in sales and marketing at the end. And the middle part, manufacturing, is actually very low value added. And I will tell you that you will hear very intelligent business people in the United States saying, let China have that middle part of the production function. We don't want it. We'll do the design, we'll do the sales and marketing, which is what we really do in the US now. If you think about Apple, the phones that are sitting in all of your pockets right now, those are designed in the United States, and they are certainly marketed and sold in the United States. They are not manufactured in the United States. Apple is worth what it is, even though they don't do any manufacturing. They outsource all of that. So it's a very interesting question about the Chinese model. I've heard a quote, I won't give the source because I didn't hear it directly, but someone who is very senior in business in the United States said, you know, Donald Trump wants to make us back like China, even though when you talk to Chinese professionals, they wish they were more like the United States, that they got more off design and sales and marketing. So I'm not convinced that this strategy of just pushing manufacturing at all costs is the right for China. Now that being said, for Pakistan, that might be a good strategy. I mean, manufacturing, I think there's a lot of talent in leather, there's a lot of talent in textiles, and so it might be smart for Pakistan to really push that manufacturing angle.
Thanks, Dr. My question is about the decentralized finance. The dealing in cryptocurrencies will be changing the scenario, especially selling the services from one person to another person, one country to another country. How US is ready for, and their central bank, about recording those transactions, and how can you put into your economy? I'm sure in third world countries it is still under consideration. But in 12 economies, is there any framework by central banks and economists? They are recording the transaction and controlling it and accounting for the economy?
So, you know, one of my teachers once told me that half of knowledge is I don't know. So I really don't know. I don't have much background in crypto. You know, I've always been taught from the kind of chartalism theory of money, which is unless the government accepts it for paying taxes, it will never be a major type of currency. And maybe I'll be disproven by that. I think the share of transactions that are being done with cryptocurrencies is still very tiny in the US, but it could change. But I really don't know that much to tell you where things are going to go on that front.
Okay, great. I think the mic is not working yet.
Am I audible? No? Okay. Very wonderful speech. What I got from your point that brand-based valuation is very important now.
So if you can speak a little louder, so I think.
Yeah. So now let me repeat. So what I got from your speech that value, brand-based value or valuation is more important for financing, right, rather than collateral-based or fund-based or asset-backed, funding. So my question is that a country like Pakistan, even the fund-based or the asset-backed financing is very, very difficult for banks because of the, very low implementation of foreclosure standards and, the legal procedures. So how would be, for Pakistan, it be, feasible for the banks to land in this way? Thanks.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, let me say two things. One, I didn't make this clear enough in the presentation, but when you're thinking about what value is created by sales and marketing, brands are for sure very important. But brands, I wouldn't say, are even half of it, okay? What's far more important when you're doing sales and marketing expense is actually the list of customers, those customer relationships, and now, more than anything else, customer data. Customer data is now in those purchase price allocations, what companies pay for when they buy other companies. Customer data is now the #1 intangible asset. So I just want to make sure everyone understands that this is not just about brand value. In fact, in some of these industries, it's not even obvious. And I just showed you those 10 largest professional, scientific, and technical services companies. My guess is 8 of them you had never even heard of. And even if I was doing this in the United States, the people would never have heard of those 8 companies. So it's not about their brand. It's about the customer relationships they get. And the second part of the answer is similar to what I said before, which is this is not where banks are going to focus. Banks are just, even in the United States, banks don't really focus here. So I think the priority for the banking system in Pakistan is the questions the deputy governor was thinking about, is the question of inclusion, of getting more of the SMEs that do textile exports, that do leather exports. The SMEs that are doing those businesses, that's the priority to get them to a bank, right? If you can get them to a bank, then you potentially could really boost exports in a way that could be very healthy for the Pakistani economy.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Sufi, I have a question that follows up to your intangible financing, how it's altered the landscape, and also to mention roughly earlier about the China question. In the last 30, 40 years, China has been the factory of the world. That is why it has elevated itself to become one of the leading economies. Now, to shift to the United States, what you were talking about, the intangible financing, how it's reallocating its resources, Donald Trump has mentioned about manufacturing, how he wants to bring it back to the United States. In 1979, 1 in 5 jobs in the United States was in manufacturing. Today, it's 1 in 20. And in the process, there have been various arguments debated about how it's benefited the United States as a result of the lower cost products that it's serviced, Walmarts and others. Now, do you feel because the intangible financing, which in the 80s and 90s, LBOs like firms like KKR, Merrill Lynch Capital Partners were the ones that were leaders in buying out these firms and redeveloping them into more productive entities. Now, in this intangible refinancing or financing that is that you talked about, I agree with that. How do you feel? Do you feel that the efforts in the United States to achieve that back to manufacturing role can be achieved? And if so, how will it be achieved, given that this private sector credit and intermediaries are going to be a tough challenge to find to fill up that gap that is needed to shift that? And also, is it realistic also? That's be an interesting question for you to.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is something I've thought a lot about. So, I think it's important to have a comparison. So if you compare the United States, the economic performance of the last 25 years, obviously you can't compare it to China. China is at a much lower level, so of course they've been growing much faster. But if you compare it to Europe, for example, the United States has massively outperformed Europe over the last 25 years. It's not even close. So much so that those of you who know Europe know they wrote the Draghi report. They're writing all these reports about stagnation in Europe. I would argue that when you think about aggregate GDP growth, the private sector's shift
toward intangible capital intensive industries has been exactly the thing that has improved growth in the United States. That's a controversial thing to say, but I think if you look at the data, it's obvious, right? Apple, Alphabet, the companies that are driving the world economy are in the United States, and they're all intangible capital intensive. Now, getting to your question, the problem, and it's a big problem, is that the distribution of income from those industries is very, very uneven. And so it fuels income inequality in a way that wasn't there with manufacturing. So I think Americans have a nostalgia for manufacturing, not because they really care so much about manufacturing, but because they have a nostalgia for those great middle-class jobs that were associated with manufacturing. And in my mind, I'm quite pessimistic that manufacturing will ever come back to the United States in a big way. And even if it came back, that it would be an industry that would have a more equal distribution of income. It's just changing so rapidly, the use of robots, the use of technology. Manufacturing is just very different. So I sympathize a great deal with the concerns of the distribution of income in the United States, and quite frankly, it's a big reason why Donald Trump is president and why we've had such big problems in the United States, because we haven't figured out how to better distribute the income from these intangible capital industries. But the short answer to your question is, I don't think a return to manufacturing is the answer. And regardless, I just don't think it's what's going to happen.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Talha Nadeem and I'm an economist at the State Bank. So I really like how you divide among low-tech and high-tech services firms. Would the picture change if instead we divided and looked at export-oriented services firms versus firms that just cater to a domestic clientele? And from a policy perspective, for a sort of perennially balance of payments constrained country like Pakistan, if we had to pick winners, should we prioritize export-oriented services firms or just any variety? Thank you.
Let me answer the second question first, which is yes, you should prioritize export-oriented services. I don't know how many of you have heard this term Baumol's disease, William Baumol. He's a famous development economist who had the idea that one of the paradoxes is as a country gets richer and richer, more and more of the consumption bundle is services. Right? So think about just in your own life, as you get richer, more and more of your money is usually spent on things like eating out. Maybe you get a nicer hairdresser, right? So these are the kinds of things, and his argument was productivity growth is naturally very low in those industries. And so if you shift more and more value added to these low-tech service businesses, then you're going to get lower and lower productivity growth in the aggregate. And so for that reason, I think you do want to focus on these high-tech services, which, as you noted, tend to be more export-oriented. So there's a few ways you could split up the services industry. One is, as you said, you could think about export-oriented versus domestic. I think another one that's very natural is business-to-business services versus business-to-households, business-to-consumer. And they all kind of split in a natural same way. So I would say they would be very correlated either way, depending on how you split it.
Okay.
My name is Harun Qasim. The previous question about the manufacturing sector, you said you are very pessimistic. So how do you see this going to happen in the US, and how do you see the economic situation turning around in this presidential term and going forward? And similarly, the manufacturing, you know, the trade war which is happening in the global world in situation, if you look at Canada and between the US, it's what I read and saw in Canada, the jobs, you know, the situation is pretty bad because of the trade tariffs. How do you see this overall, the geopolitical and the trade situation happening in the global markets? That's my question to you.
I wish I knew. I can speculate, but it's just speculation, and it's no more informed, I think, than anybody else's speculation. My guess is that the Trump presidency will end up, this part of it, the economic policy, will end up being largely unsuccessful. My guess is that we elect a fairly left-wing Democrat in 2028, and my prediction would be that the US abandons this idea of bringing back manufacturing and instead sticks with high-tech services, but tries to figure out the distributional issues better. You know, alternative minimum tax. You know, many of you here saw, given his South Asian roots, the Mamdani election in New York City. Right now, the political situation looks like people with more left-wing economic views, higher taxation, higher redistribution, issues of affordability, they look like they're winning out right now. And tariffs are not really part of that left-wing agenda. They more just want blatant redistribution, higher taxes on the rich, more healthcare coverage, more education support. And my guess is that the 2028 election will probably be a landslide for the Democrats, and that they'll probably start doing those policies. But again, my speculation is as good as anyone else's, but that's where I feel like things are going in the United States.
Okay, so we don't have much time for, but okay, so this is the last question.
Sir, my question is, what is the role of capital market in this structural transformation? What kind of role you have seen in developed and emerging market, and what countries like Pakistan can learn from those experiences?
By capital market, you mean like equity, the equity markets and like debt markets?
Stock market and equity.
Yeah. So basically, if you make it there, you're already a huge success story, right? You're already a huge success story if you make it to be publicly traded firm. And I think the expansion of public markets, stock markets in Pakistan, and I mentioned these two companies, right, that are IT service-oriented companies that are publicly traded, they represent the all-stars, you know, the ones that are super successful. So I think public markets are always going to be good and advantageous, but public markets are not going to finance freelancers, right? I mean, so you still are going to need something like venture capital, something like private equity, and of course the goal of those intermediaries is either to get the company acquired or to get the company public. And so the better the public market is, the better the incentives of the intermediaries to go ahead and invest so that they can earn that big return. So it's always great to have a more liquid public exchange, but I don't think that's a solution to the financing of these small businesses, these SMEs that really need to grow.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Amir. So before we conclude, so I would just like to hear brief comments from you on, since you have come from the US and the whole world is now worried about how the US is going to do under this Trump administration. So maybe like, what's your view on where we are heading to?
I have 3 words to answer. Pray for us.
It's not American, but very Pakistani. Like we all trust on prayers. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Amir Sufi. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you all for having me.
It was an honor for us to host you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all the participants for your very thoughtful questions. To formally conclude today's proceedings, I'd like to invite Deputy Governor, Monetary Policy and Research Group, Amin Lodi, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you, sir. Respected members of Zahid Husain family, our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Amir Sufi, Honorable former SPP Governor Yasin Anwar Sahab, my fellow Deputy Governor Salimullah Sahab and Dr. Inayat Hussain Sahab, Honorable Consul General, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening. It's an honor to offer this closing remarks for the Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture and to reflect on the timely and thought-provoking insights shared by Professor Amir Sufi. I hope this distinguished gathering will walk away with much food for thought tonight. But if I were to summarize today's lecture, so Dr. Sufi has reinforced a very important lesson, which I think we should remember. And to me, it is, as the structure of the economy evolves, so must the structure of the finance too that supports it. And in an increasingly competitive global economy, financing and supporting sustainable growth requires moving beyond what is easiest to collateralize, as Dr. Sufi said. Instead, it requires financing what underpins future productivity, innovation, and competitiveness. As highlighted by Deputy Governor Salimullah Sahab in his opening remarks, while our banking system remains well capitalized as well as profitable, its reach into the real economy is still relatively shallow. Perhaps, and more importantly, in my view, the penetration of the non-bank financial institutions is quite limited in Pakistan, whereas our equity market and the corporate debt market also remain underutilized and underdeveloped. This constraint put almost the entire burden of financing the private sector credit needs on commercial banks, which also have to cater the huge budgetary financing need that has been the case until very recently. So at the heart of the Dr. Sufi's lecture, and with your permission, the one I would like to take liberty to contextualize within our country's dynamics is the imperative for conventional financial system to evolve. There is a clear need to reorient a greater share of financial resources towards productive businesses and entrepreneurs, thereby supporting investment, innovation and job creation across the economy. For policymakers and regulators, that is we, I think the message from today's lecture is clear. Our macroprudential policies, our macro policies, our regulatory frameworks must actively incentivize the financial sector to allocate resources toward the most productive, which in our economy, as you all know, generally remain underserved, also highlighted by Salimullah Sahab. So those segments of economy must get more credit. Also, DG Sahab has highlighted and mentioned some of the initiatives and the priorities the central bank has in this regard. So let me not just repeat this, but just to add and re-emphasize one of the things, I believe the technology-driven financial firms and the real banks that we have can help bridge gap in traditional collateral framework, particularly for SME, for the underserved sectors, the firms that are there, by using alternative data for better assess future earning potential and the business viability. In this backdrop, our financial service industry must leverage, in my view, the ongoing wave of digitalization, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to redesign their credit generation processes and deposit mobilization practices. At the same time, development of a deeper and a more diversified domestic capital market is essential. So Dr. Sufi has, in answering the question, also highlighted the importance. I think this well-functioning corporate bond market and equity market can provide the long-term financing for the firms investing both in tangible and intangible capital. Something which is missing are perhaps our banks are not there to finance, and also to reduce the excessive reliance on the banking financing. Also, our businesses, I'll urge you to look beyond the traditional bank financing and make greater use of the domestic and the global capital market by tapping equity and debt market at home and abroad. The firms can diversify their funding sources, access to long-term capital, and perhaps reduce the pressure on our domestic banking system. With that, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Professor Amir Sufi for delivering such an stimulating, insightful, and very relevant lecture to the Pakistan economy. I would also like to thank particularly Dr. Waqas and his team, our research department team, for organizing such a successful event. I also would like to acknowledge Abid Kamar Saab, Noor Ahmed Saab and their teams, as well as my other colleague at SPP for their invaluable contribution to this event. I sincerely hope that Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture will continue to serve as a valuable platform for informed debate, reflection, and collective learning on issues that are central to Pakistan economy, future and development journey. With this, please join me giving a big round of applause to Dr. Amir Sufi. Thank you.
Thank you, DG Saab, for your remarks. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the conclusion of the 25th Zahid Husain Memorial Lecture. On behalf of the State Bank of Pakistan, I thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Amir Sufi, our distinguished guests, and everyone who contributed to today's success. Thank you.